Hey everyone, welcome. I'm really glad you're joining us for this explainer today because we are tackling a topic that is fundamentally reshaping how we think about the future of society. We're looking at Singapore's falling birth rates, and specifically the intense spotlight that's currently being placed on assisted reproductive technologies. Whenever a nation faces a demographic dip, there's almost always this massive rush to look to science for a silver bullet. So today, we're going to use some truly fascinating source material by Dr. Alexis Heng Boon Chin to unpack the real, on-the-ground complexities of these medical interventions. We'll strip away the hype, look really closely at the hard data, and explore what happens when cutting-edge science collides head-on with public policy. 0.87. Seriously, that is not a typo. That is a shocking statistic. It is Singapore's projected total fertility rate for the year 2026. To put that number into perspective, just to maintain a population without relying on immigration, a country generally needs a replacement rate of about 2.1, right? So at 0.87, we are looking at a literal existential threat to the demographic future of the nation. When numbers drop this dangerously low, it naturally and understandably leads to urgent, really loud calls for sweeping government intervention. People want solutions, and frankly, they want them yesterday. Okay, let's dive into this, because the very first immediate question that springs to everyone's mind is simply, can medical technology save us? Can we simply fund and expand in vitro fertilization, IVF, and other fertility treatments to engineer our way out of this crisis? Now, just to be clear, IVF is the process where an egg and sperm are combined in a lab before being implanted into the uterus. But there is a profound myth versus reality narrative happening right now around these treatments. Society often views these technologies as this ultimate cure-all, but the source material we are examining today warns us that leaning too heavily on a purely medical solution might actually be a very dangerous oversimplification. So here is our roadmap for today's explainer. We're going to start by framing Singapore's demographic crisis, then examine the limits of IVF. From there, we'll look at the current debates surrounding PGTA and private clinics, uncover the egg freezing reality, navigate the ethical and legal hurdles, and finally, look ahead at future tech and policy. We're going to systematically explore the full spectrum of these interventions. All right, let's kick things off with Section 1, Singapore's demographic crisis. When a nation sees its birth rate just totally plummet, the immediate societal reaction is a massive policy push. The demands usually center around enhanced subsidies, way more financial support for aspiring parents, and liberalizing restrictive assisted reproductive technology or ART regulations. Basically, the instinct is to just throw open the floodgates of accessibility. However, the source material explicitly warns us that before rushing into these sweeping policy changes to broaden access, there are some absolutely crucial caveats and limitations that we must consider if we want these policies to be both effective and sustainable. Which brings us right into Section 2, the limits of IVF. We really have to question the actual mathematical impact of medical interventions on national demographics. And this brilliantly illustrates a massive reality check. Globally, based on records from other developed nations, IVF and assisted reproductive technologies max out at contributing to around 10% of a country's total live births. Tops. That leaves a massive 90% of live births coming from entirely outside these medical interventions. This is a vital takeaway here. While IVF is deeply meaningful and utterly life-changing for individual families, mathematically speaking, a 10% contribution cannot single-handedly fix a national total fertility rate that is sitting below 1.0. It's just one piece of a much, much larger puzzle. Plus, we have an economic reality we have to face, the law of diminishing returns. The source points out that, as public funding and financial assistance for IVF expand, that money doesn't necessarily create a proportional boom in babies across the broader population. Instead, those funds disproportionately go toward highly complex, very expensive procedures. You end up benefiting a much smaller pool of patients who have more severe, difficult-to-treat fertility issues. So the bottom line is, simply throwing more public tax dollars at the problem doesn't guarantee a widespread demographic turnaround. Let's move along to Section 3, PGTA and private clinics, and see how this builds into the specific policy proposals that are being so intensely debated right now. One major debate is whether public IVF co-funding should be extended to private fertility clinics. Now, aspiring parents understandably advocate for this because private clinics offer vastly reduced waiting times. But here is a glaring policy contradiction. Private clinics are fundamentally driven by shareholder profitability. And currently, the government does not even subsidize treatments for actual life-threatening diseases like cancer or heart disease when they're treated in private hospitals. So it raises a really difficult question regarding the allocation of public funds. Is it actually cost-efficient and fair to subsidize private fertility treatments? Or should those precious resources be kept strictly within public hospitals to expand the services there? Another massive debate revolves around the normalization of a procedure called PGTA. Essentially, this is pre-implantation genetic testing for aneuploidy. It's a way of screening IVF embryos for chromosomal abnormalities, like Down syndrome, before they are ever implanted. Proponents are pushing hard for it to be subsidized, mainly because of the rising global trend of older motherhood, which we know inherently carries an increased risk of these chromosomal abnormalities. However, the source points out that clinical trials currently underway in public hospitals to prove its broad efficacy remain entirely inconclusive. In fact, there are some pretty serious red flags associated with PGTA that we need to unpack. First off, numerous large-scale clinical trials worldwide have consistently shown that PGTA does not significantly improve overall IVF success rates. Because of this, major professional medical bodies in both the USA and the UK actually caution against using it widely as a standard add-on. Even more concerning are the risks of misdiagnosis, where perfectly viable healthy IVF embryos might be accidentally flagged and discarded. To ground this risk in reality, the source cites a huge Australian lawsuit where the fertility company Monash IVF had to compensate 700 former patients with 56 million Australian dollars for faulty genetic testing that directly compromised their chances of parenthood. So the stakes here are incredibly high. Which brings us to Section 4, the egg freezing reality. Elective egg freezing was legalized in Singapore starting in 2023, and already there are loud calls to aggressively expand its age limits and public subsidies. Let's look at the actual motivations behind this policy push. The goal is to enable younger women to freeze their eggs when their biological quality is optimal. And yes, there are proposals to extend the current age limit beyond 37. But the primary societal justification for elective egg freezing is absolutely fascinating. It's often promoted to give women more time to find a compatible life partner. The source highlights a deeply ingrained sociological phenomenon called the mating gap. See, in many developed countries, female university graduates now significantly outnumber their male peers, because traditional marriage expectations often involved women marrying men with equal or higher education. A persistent incompatibility in the dating market has formed. Technology is essentially being used here to buy time against a sociological mismatch. But here's the catch: less than 1 in 10. Overseas studies consistently estimate that less than 10% of women who freeze their eggs will ever actually utilize them. The overwhelming majority literally never thaw them. This represents a jarring reality and a fundamental contradiction. If a government aggressively expands public subsidies or allows public healthcare funds to be used for elective egg freezing, it is potentially looking at a massive waste of tax dollars on a procedure that, statistically, goes largely unused. It vividly shows that simply providing medical access cannot magically resolve a societal mating app. All right, let's transition into Section 5, ethical and legal hurdles. This is where the laboratory directly collides with jurisprudence and national laws. First up, we have what the source refers to as the donor dilemma. Singapore faces a severe national shortage of donated sperm, eggs, and embryos. Why? Well, because the Bioethics Advisory Committee has strictly banned monetary compensation for donors. They view it as an undue financial inducement that turns human biology into a commodity. But with the rise of elective egg freezing, we're going to see a huge buildup of unused frozen eggs. So now there's an ongoing ethical debate. Some argue we should partially compensate these women if they donate their unused eggs, framing it as reimbursing their initial medical fees. But others counter-argue that if you allow a woman to freeze her eggs for herself, but then pay her if she later decides she doesn't need them and gives them away, critics argue you've essentially created a backdoor way to pay for egg donation. Deciding to donate later shouldn't retroactively transform a private expense into a compensatable donation. It is a remarkably tricky ethical line to walk. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is seeing how expanding these technologies triggers a massive chain reaction. Think about the contradictions here. If you permit surrogacy, you risk the rise of black market agencies, the profound exploitation of impoverished foreign women, and incredibly complex transactional custody disputes. If you push for IVF for same-sex partners, the source points out it is totally incongruous with current national prohibitions on same-sex marriage. And if you allow sperm donor IVF for single women, it directly contradicts current public housing policies that systematically disadvantage unmarried mothers. The takeaway? Expanding assisted reproductive technology isn't just some isolated medical decision. It requires unpicking a massive interconnected web of deeply held legal and social frameworks. Finally, let's shift our focus to the horizon. In Section 6, Future Tech and Policy, what exactly does the absolute cutting edge look like?
Right now, there are emerging calls for government investment in highly experimental, futuristic technologies. Two in particular really stand out. IVG, or in vitro gametogenesis, which is the incredible creation of functional sperm and eggs from entirely different human body cells, and actually, this has already shown promise in animal studies. The second is three-parent IVF, a mitochondrial transfer therapy that can help older women with poor egg quality by transferring healthy egg contents from young donors. I know they sound straight out of science fiction, but they are rapidly emerging realities in global research labs.
But how should a nation's public policy actually handle them? The source material concludes that Singapore currently lacks the massive R&D base in these highly specific niche areas. Plus, the pool of patients with fertility problems severe enough to require these incredibly advanced technologies is actually very, very small. Therefore, the most prudent, cost-effective step-by-step approach isn't to race to invent it here. Step 1. Await the maturation and rigorous testing of these technologies in other countries. Step 2. Import them subsequently through standard licensing agreements only once they are proven fully safe and clinically effective. It's a calculated, patient approach to policy that prevents us from falling for the silver bullet fallacy. So the crucial point is summarized perfectly by Dr. Alexis Heng-Boon Shin. The government must carefully consider these significant caveats and potential pitfalls to ensure effective and ethically sound outcomes. We literally cannot just blindly throw public funding at private clinics, ignore the massive non-usage rates of frozen eggs, or blind ourselves to the glaring legal and ethical contradictions. Expanding technology as a knee-jerk reaction, that's just not a strategy. Which brings us to the ultimate question I want to leave you with today. As we face down an existential drop in birth rates, are we looking in the wrong direction? Should we invest our hopes and massive public funds in pursuing ever more complex medical miracles? Or is it time we truly committed to fixing the deep, societal, and structural roots of our demographic crisis? It's a heavy question for sure, but looking past the hype and demanding hard evidence, as we've done today, is the absolutely necessary first step toward finding the right answer. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the data.